So, how you doing?
We're doing well. This is this spring? It feels like spring right
It's
now.
almost spring, yeah. In Maine, we
feels
are
like
hitting temps of 50s here in February. It's bizarre. But anyway, we're not here to talk about the weather. We're here to talk about our organizational unit structure
Sure,
in our Google admin domain.
absolutely.
I often get asked the question, we're going to go Google, how do we set this up appropriately? And I think it warrants a conversation and some structural type of theory first before you just dive right in.
Sure. Background.
Yeah.
I've been in IT for 18 years now.
Woo! You're old.
Maybe. I've worked in the businesses. I've done Microsoft Active Directory from the start of it in Microsoft 2000. So I've been working on that I was working on that for 15 years before I jumped into the Google bandwagon. So
Right.
a lot of the stuff that I do and a lot of the structural organization that I like is based on my older format with Microsoft.
Yeah.
So
Well, it makes sense. And I know when we went Google 5 years ago here in New York, that was a big kind of thing. How do we set this up? And we looked at different things. I actually attended a boot camp for admins by Amplified IT, a great resource that's out there. But you know, sometimes I just get asked quick questions, and I'm happy to assist.
sure.
All right. So number one question usually comes up is, I'm about to go Google. Do I want to have all my users in the same domain, or should we separate it out, students and staff, two different domains?
I wouldn't separate it to different domains.
No, definitely not.
That really definitely confuses things a lot more because you have to make sure you have whitelisted permissions between the two domains. The way I look at it with Google for Education, G Suite for Education, is that there isn't a limit, as far as I'm aware,
Right.
on the amount of accounts that you can have.
Not that I
So
know.
there's no reason why you need to separate them into two domains.
Right.
That's
And the nice thing is, if you have a clean and worthy OU structure, which we're going to talk about here in a second, you can set permission level per OU.
Yep.
So everyone can be under the same root directory domain,
Right.
but we can set very different permissions, which you'd want to do.
And absolutely, because there are certainly things that you don't want to have your kids to have access to.
Right.
And it's not based on, whether or not you trust your kids.
Right.
It's the law.
Yeah.
There are certain aspects of G Suite that you can turn on
Right.
that are not FERPA COPA compliant.
Right.
So we got to make sure we're paying attention to that as we deal with our structural organization.
And especially when we're talking about third-party apps and permissioning there later on. So we usually start at the root, and
Yeah.
then we talk about our final four, right? This is sort of like March Madness. It looks a little like bracketology.
It does look like bracketology when you split it out like this and you put it into your diagram. We always do, like I said, start at the top, and the domain usually you want to set up with just your default permissions. However you set up, you just leave it at default permissions because you're going to change anything under it anyways.
Right.
And you shouldn't be saving any of your users or groups under your domain, under your root of your organization.
Right.
So that's start one when you start going. What I like to do, and again, this comes from my background with Microsoft, is I separate out from there my users and devices. So we'll have users and a bunch of organizations under users, and then I have devices set from there.
Right. And that makes sense.
Yeah.
I know there are some people that are of the notion you should throw your devices in the same grouping as your users because the permissions for set A users would be the same as their devices. But this way we can move devices in and out a little bit easier without worrying about which users they're in too. So it sort of helps in some aspects to have them separated.
Right, and for the aspect of how we're going to organize our group, our permissions that we want to set on our devices are static.
Right.
For the most part, we're going to have things on there that are printers and network settings and things like that on the device. We don't need to be changing those as those devices, because those devices aren't going to move buildings for the most part for us.
Right.
Our students will move buildings at some point.
Yeah,
Move grades. So those permissions that are set on there, we want to move that up and down.
Correct.
So that's just kind of the tip how we can do it. You can certainly separate them out all under one OU as well. I mean, if you really wanted to, you could possibly put your under students under your building. You could put your devices under that. That is certainly an option.
Right.
But for me, again, from being back in my older Active Directory days, I like having completely separate devices. That way I know that that's specifically the area I'm looking at when I'm changing those permissions.
Right. So let's jump back to users for a second, because probably everybody should separate their users into staff and students at the very least.
Correct. you kind of have to.
Yeah,
right?
I mean,
as we talked about before with
FERPA.
compliancy.
Another one that comes up an awful lot is incognito mode. So the ability to surf in incognito mode on Chrome,
Yep.
which doesn't cache or save any of your history. Very useful for staff.
Right.
You can have somebody log into your computer using incognito mode and not worry about it mixing with your stuff.
Sure.
Not so, well, very useful for students too, but maybe in the wrong ways. They could surf for things that we wouldn't know about.
Another instance that you may want to look at is now when you can set up printers via IP address on a Chromebook.
So much easier than Chrome Print.
But you're still doing it under device settings, user settings.
Right.
So that setup for that IP address printer is under a user setting. So you may have different printers set up for your staff than you do for your students.
Yeah.
So that's all.
One in a teacher's lounge, for instance, wouldn't be available to students.
Right. So you could set that up under that building and then put everyone else in there. Whereas for students, again, you could set that printer up under that building,
Right.
and you're just moving your class of in there. So that way, every time your class moves on,
Right.
whether it's between buildings, they'll get those new settings based upon how they.
So just to bring
go
clarity,
forward.
Tom, we have our high school or middle school and our elementary buildings, and then
Mhm.
you said class of. Instead of saying 12th grade, 11th grade, why class of?
For me, I just like it a little bit better because the way we set up our student accounts is first initial, last name, year of graduation.
Yeah.
So for us, it just matches it easy. That's, I think, the main reason why we do it that way.
I think another big reason too is that the class of isn't going to change, right? Our kindergartners are class of 2030, I believe. They're going to be class of 2030 for 13 years, whereas if we labeled it kindergarten, we'd have to rename that OU every time we move them year after year after year.
Yeah, that is certainly now no child left behind. It really is.
Yeah,
I
it's
mean,
true. It's
it's
true.
very rare that you see somebody that is held back.
Hmm.
If it is, it's for a real serious reason that they were held back. And I mean, at that point, you can easily move that user back and forth between
Right.
that class of if you needed to. But yeah, again, you really want to match your structure and your naming convention.
Yes.
I think that's a
Naming
big thing.
conventions are huge in Google.
Right. So if you have something that says J Doe 24,
Right.
put into eighth. I don't know if this is the right grade. Eighth grade.
Mm.
That could actually, I think it would be sixth grade. Anyways, that could be a little bit confusing to anyone that has to administer it, especially if you have a change of the guard.
Right.
For instance, if you're not, the person who's your Google admin leaves, that they want to be able to see things in an easy way to be able to go and
Right.
transfer forward.
And it should be simple.
It should.
Yeah.
Right?
So you mentioned something else. You said users and devices are separate. You also
did.
talked about user permissions and device permissions. So the question I often get is there are some places in the admin console where it appears the same setting for devices and the same setting for users, or at least kind of similar.
Right.
Is there one that trumps another one? Does user permissions trump device settings or vice versa?
It's not necessarily trumps. What happens is when you load up your Chromebook, it reaches out to your organization and it reads those permissions first.
So device permissions first.
So it always reads device permissions first. So those are what it's out there. It will then go when you sign in and pull your user permissions. I haven't come across too many times where there is a permission on a user side that conflicts with the device one.
Right.
Google has been very good as they've gone on and separating a lot of stuff so that there are very few things that would actually trump.
Match anymore, right?
The one big thing where you could come up with some confusion on, again, going back to printers, is the user printers compared to Google Cloud Print printers.
Sure.
You would see that in two different locations though. So,
Right.
but anyways, whenever you do it, it always pulls your device permissions first because that's the first thing that it connects on with.
That makes sense. Okay. So take us down through what else we have left on our OU
So
structure.
as we hit it, you can see when we go through our device, our OU structure, we hit our schools, we can then separate out our permissions on our devices based upon whether they're a cart device or a loaner device. We may want to set some of the things different on it depending upon what they're being purposed for.
Right.
It just makes life easier. Then you can just transfer those devices back and forth to change those permissions.
And that makes sense in York because we have sort of a mixed bag. At our elementary, it's
Sure.
charts. In our middle school, it's 1-to-1, and in
Sure.
our high school, it's BYOD. So we literally have different permissions set for every building.
Yep. And the final part that we look at is our test OU.
Big one.
That is something that I've always been a big part of, is having test users. That way, when you have new permissions that come out, you want to make sure that it's not going to blow everything up. One of the big things that came out recently was with the device settings.
Yeah.
If you turn on manage all mobile devices and you log into your Google account with an Android phone, all of a sudden you're going to start pop-ups about managing it.
Right.
That's something you want to test out before you turn it on for everyone to make sure you're not going to get a bunch of complaints.
Right.
based
You
on it.
don't need personal Android phones all of a sudden coming on and having people argue about it.
And so, I mean, as we look at this and as we finish up here, you notice this is actually a fairly big list here that's no longer, oh, there it goes. The scroll got a little wonky. But it looks like it's a fairly big list, and it can be. It can be a very daunting task, especially if you're splitting out more and more and more. But really, in the end, once you get it all set, it is the rotisserie chicken. Set it and forget it.
Oh, yeah. There you go.
That's where we end up with it. You have your review structure, as long as you are comfortable and you're happy where it is, and you know that if something were to happen, you could go back and easily construct it, or someone else could follow very easily.
Right.
You're good to go. You very rarely have to go back and.
The only time you have to go back is when Google changes something, which is often, but that's exactly what this test OU is for.
Right.
We try it out. We say, all right, who would this work for?
Right.
Maybe it's a small group. Maybe it's the whole group. Maybe
Right.
it's somewhere in between.
And you said the last part of it really is, put the thought process in to start.
First.
Yeah, go through
Even
and
whiteboard it.
and whiteboard it out like this, put it in a diagram, make it in a way that you can understand,
Yeah.
and then build it out.
And we built this in Lucid Chart. It's a great tool for that kind
Great
of thing.
tool.
Mind mapping it out.
Yep. It's the diagram will really help you, because when you look at your organization, you're going to see it kind of sort of like this. You got the little arrows and it'll break out. So
So that's that.
that's that. That is how we deal with our organizational structure.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully this helps you in the daunting task of yours.
Yeah.